Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Corinne Momal-Vanian. I'm the Executive Director of the Kofi Annan Foundation. A warm welcome to another installment of our series examining the impact of COVID-19 on elections and democratic processes. We've held several of these webinars over the course of the year, and we try to assess the impact in different regions and identify conditions that allow voters to exercise their political rights and freedoms while remaining healthy and safe. The past discussions are still available online. Today, we're looking at the situation in the United States less than a week before the elections. As we all know, the US faces rather a tense and contentious election for many reasons, elevated levels of polarization, antagonism between parties, and so on. But really today we will focus on the specific impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, the response by federal and state authorities, and the role that technology can play in supporting electoral integrity in a pandemic. My guest today is Nate Persily, a professor of law at Stanford University, a member of the Kofi Annan Commission on Elections and Democracy in the Digital Age. Nate, welcome and thank you for being with us. Nate is also the co-lead of the Stanford MIT Healthy Elections Project, designed to ensure that the 2020 election can proceed with integrity and safety. Thank you to all of you who are joining us today. And like the rest of the world, we are now, 8 or 9 months, depending on where we are, into the pandemic. And it's not really going very well. That's the least we can say. In fact, this week we recorded the highest levels of new infections since New March in many countries, including the United States. So if I might start, Nate, with a very blunt question. Can the US hold an election with integrity in the midst of a pandemic?
The answer is yes, and we are doing it right now, and we are seeing record turnout. The turnout in the U.S. this year will be higher than probably any election since 1960. Right now, we expect that roughly 150 to 160 million people will turn out to vote, as compared to 130 to 140 last time. And we have record numbers of people voting by mail. Over 82 million people have requested or received mail ballots. And we have, lines in early voting stations going around the block. So we are holding the election. It was incredibly difficult logistical undertaking. And of course, it remains to be seen what happens on election day. But the election officials in the U.S. have done a pretty good job so far.
Great, thank you. But when you were part of the Kofi Annan Commission, you argued strongly that we needed to understand which challenges to election were new and were linked to social media, which is what the Commission looked at, and to the internet and social media, and which ones had already existed but were simply exacerbated by these new tools. But likewise with COVID, do you think it has created new challenges or simply really exacerbated existing weaknesses in US electoral administration? Because there has been a lot of discussion about voter suppression, gerrymandering, the impact of the Electoral College. All these issues really predate the pandemic. So what is in fact new?
So I think that is the central question. And I'll say that, when I began this election season, right after we had released the Kofi Annan Commission report, I thought most of what I'd be doing this election would be dealing with disinformation, hate speech, incitement, political advertising online and the like, mainly in my role as the head of the Stanford Cyber Policy Center. But I took off that hat and then put on my hat as the former research director of the President's Commission on Election Administration. This was the commission that President Obama put together to deal with things like long lines on election day, voting technology, natural disasters in voting. We hadn't ever thought about pandemics in voting at the time, but since I've been doing a lot of work with local election officials back then, we sort of dusted that off, and my colleague Charles Stewart at MIT and I started this project. And it really was to deal with, as you say, the pandemic-specific effects of this election. Now, it's not as if those other problems, such as disinformation or cybersecurity or polarization generally, went away. It is the case, I think, that the pandemic exacerbates those problems. And if we were if the United States was not such a hyper polarized political environment, we might be able to deal more coherently and nationally with the problems that the pandemic poses for our elections. But we have incredible polarization here, and we're also, in an environment where we worry about cybersecurity, disinformation, and the like. So disinformation can come in many forms. It can come related to COVID, related to COVID's effect on the elections, and in particular, how to vote and how to deal with the voting results. Because if you were worried about disinformation before, think about what it means when you have tens of millions of people voting in a new way that they've never experienced before. It provides an opportunity for malicious actors to, whether it's online or otherwise, to misrepresent how the voting process works. Similarly, since it's going to take some time for us to report results after Election Day, that provides a period in which bad actors are able to propagate disinformation over who may have won or lost the election.
Indeed. But one thing which is very specific to the United States also is, of course, the federal nature of its constitution. And how do you see that the division of roles and responsibilities between federal and state authorities has impacted or not the electoral administration during a pandemic? Have some states reacted better than others? Has it complicated things overall?
This is one of those things about the American electoral system that foreign observers find quite surprising, which is that not only do we devolve authority down to each of the 50 states, but they further devolve authority down to 10,000 local jurisdictions, many of which are quite different in the rules that they apply, in the technology that they use, even the political cultures of those jurisdictions. And so our different states are adapting to this pandemic in very different ways. And so before this election, we already had 5 states that had all vote by mail elections. That was Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Utah, and Hawaii. They've now been joined by states like California, Vermont, Washington, D.C., New Jersey, all of whom are going to be mailing every registered voter a mail ballot. Now, something like a place like California was better able to do that than other states because 2/3 of Californians had been voting by mail already. Similarly, a place like Arizona, which didn't move to all vote by mail, still has significant vote by mail where roughly 80% of their population had voted by mail before. And so that you see different shifts in those states, particularly in the West, but not exclusively. And then there are states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and North Carolina, which have had historic rates of absentee ballot usage at around 5%. And so for them to ramp up, to make the big transition to major numbers of mail ballots has been quite a logistical undertaking. And so they continue to have what's known as no excuse absentee balloting, where a voter has to request a ballot and then will be able to get it. But as I said, the numbers are going to be quite different. It required a lot more training of the election officials, buying new equipment and the like. And then there are some states where you still have to provide an excuse if you want an absentee ballot, a place like Texas and others, where we should expect not as much mail voting, but much more early in-person voting.
So quite a challenge for many states, indeed. Another thing is that in our work around the world, we have seen that often it's not bad will or poor regulations, but it's just a lack of resources for people in charge of administering the elections that gets in the way of electoral integrity. And in March, President Trump signed into law an act, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief and Economic Security Act, which included $400 million in emergency election administration funds distributed to states. How have states been spending this money, and has the support been simply sufficient to cover all the additional costs related to COVID? And you were mentioning some of them.
It's been critical for them to have what's known as the CARES Act funding. That $400 million was spent quite quickly, and different jurisdictions bought different equipment, training, poll worker pay, and the like. It's probably about 10% of what was needed in order to make the kind of full transition, but then some states and localities have stepped up. And you even have a strange phenomenon in this election where you have private philanthropy coming in to give money directly to jurisdictions. So the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative gave over $250 million through the Center for Technology and Civic Life to jurisdictions in order to help them. So in some ways, private philanthropy has matched public dollars to try to pull off this election. I would say that from the standpoint of resources, at least in the battleground states, I think we're in a pretty good position. I think they have most of what they need in order to pay poll workers, in order to provide for the protective equipment and the like, as well as to buy the mail balloting equipment. It would have been nice to have a lot more of this money earlier, because early money would have, I think, served certain other purposes where they could have bought, for example, a lot more ballot drop-off locations or other kinds of material like that. But now the most important resource is time, right? And time is running out. And so the jurisdictions are sort of triaging what they can do in these final days.
Well, it's good to know that these resources were useful. And you mentioned the work that you're doing with your colleagues at MIT on the Healthy Elections Project. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the project does and what some of its main findings are?
So the project is both an academic project, which is producing research, but also helping to provide direct services to jurisdictions, building on what we had done when I was director of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. So through an array of partners like Democracy Works, Center for Technology and Civic Life, Center for Election Innovation and Research, and others, we're trying to help out and respond to the needs of local election officials around the country. For example, we work with a group called Power the Polls to try to help recruit poll workers, because one of the things that happened with the pandemic is that the normal cadre of poll workers, many of them are not showing up because the average age of a poll worker in the United States is over 60 years old, and they're most at risk for the pandemic. So we needed to recruit hundreds of thousands of new people to help out at the polls. Similarly, if you go to healthyelections.org, you will see research on all the issues relevant to the pandemic and the election. Things like the mail system, the election infrastructure supply chain, issue reports for particular states, as well as a litigation tracker to track over 300 cases that have been filed so far. We also work with the Stanford Design School to design tools for local jurisdictions to set up healthy polling places and advice for poll workers to help them with training that's been implemented in some states. And there's an array of tools on the website, sort of technical tools that local administrators can use to deal with things like ensuring social distance in voting, how to deal with a long line in voting, and to prepare in other ways for the pandemic.
But these sound like really useful tools for a lot of other countries to use, and I hope they'll be still available online for anybody to use in the future, because I mean those challenges, of course, are the same all over the world. But bringing back the subject to information and really to the findings and recommendations of the Kofi Annan Commission on elections and democracy in the digital age. Do you think that the pandemic has sort of shifted the debate in terms of the deployment of technology also in the elections? Here in Switzerland, for instance, where the Kofi Annan Foundation is based, the federal government has launched a project last year to look at all the issues linked to e-voting, noting that e-voting can open up new opportunities for democracy by allowing voters to cast their votes wherever they are in a mobile manner. Is a similar reflection ongoing in the US, and has the pandemic added momentum to it? Is there, do you think, on the horizon the possibility of voting online?
So I was part of the National Academy of Sciences panel in the United States dealing with the future of voting technology, and we recommended not to move forward with internet voting. And that's because, at least in the United States, we do not think it's secure enough. Because if you are going to roll out a system of internet voting, it has to be a system in which the loser is confident that he or she has lost. And unless we reach levels of trust in the online environment where everyone can say, yes, this was a fair election, and the loser concedes because they believe the system worked. But right now, we don't have trust in the United States, even in the basic sort of use of electronics in voting locations. So the debate in the last 15 years in the United States was not really about internet voting or moving there, but whether we should allow for computers to be the main source of vote tallying in the polling place. And we've moved almost completely in the United States to a paper-based system, not only through absentee voting, but even if you use a computer in the polling place, it's usually what we call a ballot marking device, which produces a piece of paper that then is the ballot, so that there can be a permanent record of the vote in the event you need to do a recount and the like. And so in the United States, we're definitely not ready for internet voting. But just because we in the US aren't doesn't mean that can't be tried elsewhere. So there are other countries like Estonia that has moved to internet voting. Other places have done it for primary elections. And clearly something like that is going to happen in the future, but it really requires that the population be ready for it. Also, it requires a country to have sort of a digital authentication and verification system and a digital identity, which is what Estonia has. And so perhaps Switzerland could try something like that out. We in the United States, we don't even have national identification cards, right? Most countries in the world do. And so we don't have a national registry of citizens like most countries do. And so it'd be very difficult to pull off a system like that.
But I see that the pandemic hasn't really moved the debate there, and that there are indeed a lot of challenges to be addressed first before this can be really tackled. But a key, to come back to the Kofi Annan Commission, a key concern of the Commission was disinformation. We've seen a lot of this, as you said at the start, around COVID. In fact, I know that the United Nations and the World Health Organizations have talked of an infodemic as serious as the pandemic itself. So how would you say COVID-related disinformation has impacted levels of trust and polarization and voter turnout, or otherwise affected the vote?
Well, I think that the issue of COVID disinformation is certainly larger than the vote. And so what we see in the US is incredible polarization on basic facts about the pandemic, about the therapeutics that are available and how successful they are, about basic questions about what you can do with the pandemic, what's contagious, what's not. But a lot of this is not necessarily disinformation that's sort of in the surreptitious mold that we saw in 2016, but it's coming from leaders. So, it's very difficult, whether it's Facebook or another platform, to deal with disinformation when it comes out of the mouths of political authorities in the United States. And so that is a problem writ large. Now, thinking about then how it affects elections, there's the issue of the transitions that were made in order to deal with the pandemic and the elections. So the issue of mail ballot fraud has obviously become quite a bit of sort of an issue on the platforms and how they deal with allegations that mail ballots are inherently tainted by fraud. That, again, is something that you don't have to turn on. You don't have to be on Facebook or Twitter in order to see that. You'll see that on television, right, or from the White House. So there's only so much that the platforms and others can do on this, but they are trying, and they're getting into a lot of trouble with it because then they get accused of political bias. And so this infodemic with respect to coronavirus has an analog in the election sphere, and in particular, we should be aware of this in the post-election period, as I said, thinking about how disinformation might flood the zone after the polls close to try to undermine confidence in the election, I think is a very important question.
So in a way, you're saying that the issue is not so much the social media platforms anymore, but rather a lot of the politicians themselves. And yet, we were reading this week, there was an article in Forbes, I think, that said that 72% of US voters do use social media. I think it was 68% are active on Facebook. So this is an enormous percentage of the population. And you're saying the social media platforms are trying. But are there recommendations from your commission's report that haven't quite been implemented by social media platforms and that would be maybe particularly relevant in the pandemic?
Well, I don't want to say that they're doing everything that they should. No, and I also don't want to suggest that they're blameless in this. They do the algorithms, whether it's YouTube or Twitter or Facebook, I think exacerbate polarization, and they also, end up fostering disinformation. The fact that the origins of that disinformation might be official sources then doesn't make them blameless. It just puts them in a really difficult position about how they prioritize information, because the most important feature of these internet platforms is their algorithms that decide what appears at the top of your newsfeed and what appears at the bottom. And that they are responsible for, right? These are not sort of open public squares where everybody has an equal chance to speak. The platforms make decisions about what kind of information is served to you. Now, one thing that's been interesting, particularly on the Facebook side, but also Twitter has done this as well, is that they are at the top of people's feeds in the United States right now. People are getting reliable voting information. And so they're pushing out information on how to register, on how to do a mail ballot, all of that kind of stuff. And they're trying to take the approach of flooding the zone with good information to try to mute the bad effect of bad information. But look, they as we said, there's a lot that they should be doing. The most important thing, and one of the recommendations from the Kofi Annan Commission report, is greater transparency so that we understand exactly what's going on here. Because we have kind of folk theories about the degree of disinformation and hate speech on these platforms, but we really don't know how big a deal it is. And so they should be compelled, and it's challenging to do this with existing privacy rules, but they should be compelled to turn over their data for academic analysis, independent analysis, to see how big a problem disinformation and these other issues are.
So we don't even know the scale of the problem, in other words, but there are good practices that have been put in place for this election that we hope also could be put in place in other countries, such as you said, flooding the platforms with good information. I think this is something really that should be replicated elsewhere. In fact, a key partner in our electoral work, the Open Society Foundation, has recently put together guidelines for civil society on elections integrity in times of COVID. And the guidelines have focused a great deal on protecting what they call the integrity of the information environment, which they see as really deeply problematic at the best of times, and even of more concern during an election when most of the electoral activity has shifted online. They point that the pandemic has brought to light the extent of change that is needed in many countries in order for this information environment to be appropriately regulated and working in service of democracy. And this, I believe, is also a concern that you share. You were saying they have to be compelled, the social media platform, for instance. But what kind of regulation would you advocate?
So one thing we need to understand is that the issue of social media regulation, particularly in the United States, is incredibly polarizing. In fact, just yesterday, you had the leaders of Facebook, Google, and Twitter testifying before the United States Senate, where Republicans, their basic view was the problem with these companies is that they're censoring the right, they're censoring conservatives, whereas the problem is that Democrats see it is that they're allowing too much disinformation and hate speech and incitement on the platform. And so the different critics have different criticisms of the social media and internet platforms. And so it is quite difficult to solve all of those problems simultaneously, because, for example, if you go after disinformation, then it's likely you'll have winners and losers in that battle, and then the platforms will be deciding that. Now, what we need is outside institutions that help make some of these decisions for these platforms, right? We need industry associations to develop standards on content moderation. We need greater transparency, which will allow not just academics to analyze what is going on, but also allow other outside institutions to create alternative methods of moderation that then can be used on the platform. So for example, right now, if you're on Facebook, you are basically hostage to their system of moderation as to how your newsfeed would be organized. What we need is to regulate these companies so that we can choose different moderation systems. So if I want a moderation system that's going to be equally conservative and liberal, that I ought to be able to opt into it. If I want to have a more kind of free-formed anarchic news feed, that I should be able to opt into it. But the only way this works is through government compulsion, because it would require these companies to turn over the ability to get on the platform for these third parties that would offer these moderation services. Now, it also requires that we understand the trade-offs with what we call data protection or privacy, because this idea that I was just talking about of trying to break up the power of these large corporations and allow other smaller companies to essentially provide moderation services requires that they have access to some of the Facebook data. Now, that is the Cambridge Analytica problem that really led to a lot of the controversies in the last 4 years, which is outsiders having access to the platforms. And so this is just why governments really need to be involved to try to set the rules to allow for that kind of transparency and competition.
And hopefully, some of the decisions that are taken by some governments, others can learn from. And in general, Nate, I mean, this I think has the U.S. election in 2020 is probably the most watched election in the whole world ever. I mean, the amount of interest, trepidation, excitement that it's generating is really, I think, unprecedented. So I think anything that happens, frankly, whether it's good practices that are being applied, such as some of the ones we've discussed, or bad things that happen, will be watched by the whole world, and it will have an impact everywhere that we also are active. But we find that, and maybe that will be my last question, we found that the period immediately after an election is usually the best time to push for electoral reforms. Do you see any appetite at either the federal or state level for serious reforms to voting procedures after the November election, whichever way it goes?
I do, and I think that there are some changes that were made specific to the COVID environment, which are going to be difficult to undo. And so there are some of these states that I mentioned before that don't have long histories of mail balloting. And right now, the population is going to start expecting that they're going to have that option. And so some of these temporary fixes I do expect to become permanent. But what you raise is a more fundamental question, which is, will we have greater federal national regulation in the US to provide a kind of floor or baseline for our democracy? And I think it really does depend on the results of the elections, because Democrats and Republicans in the United States disagree on what the challenges are and what we should be able to do about it. But I would expect that there will be quite a lot of activity to provide sort of greater buttressing for the right to vote after this election.
And I'm sure, Nate, you'll be at the center of this activity. So thank you again, really, for a fascinating conversation. I would have many, many more questions, but I know you are extremely, extremely busy this week, 5 days before the election. So we'll see what happens. I want to thank also all the people who've been watching us online. We had decided to keep it to 30 minutes, and I'm keeping it to 30 minutes. So I think we've kept everybody interested. Thank you so much, Nate.
Thank you.
Let's see what happens on Tuesday.
Fingers crossed.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.